Hello, I'm Katrin Kohl. I'm one of the tutors in the University of Oxford in the Department of German, and I'm at Jesus College. This was a collection that was, for me, very important in discovering poetry. The first poem I really spent some time on analysing was Das Karussell, which I loved because it was so vivid, and the more you looked at it, the more you could see how the words were bringing alive images in your mind. What I'll be talking about primarily is different ways of using figurative speech to convey something that is inanimate, that doesn't have feelings, it's an edifice, that's a thing, but where Rilke uses imagery, so metaphor, simile, personification, those are the three I'll talk about, to evoke this thing that is there in the title, and where this title sets up that idea, and that is then elaborated in the rest of the poem. The poem I'll be looking at is Die Treppe der Orangerie, the steps of the Orangery, and it evokes a magnificent flight of steps in the Palace of Versailles, built in the reign of France's Sun King Louis XIV in the 17th century. So firstly, a simile is, examples might be, it's like herding cats. So a simile would be X is like Y. It's like herding cats, but actually it's clear to everybody you're not actually herding cats. In fact, that would be very difficult. That's the whole point of the simile. But it's when you're trying to get people to move all in the same direction and everybody's going somewhere else and doing something different. Or they're fighting like cats and dogs. Again, we know exactly that the people aren't cats and aren't dogs, but the way they're fighting reminds us of that. Or time is like an arrow is quite a well-established old poetic simile. Again, it's this word like. Metaphor, by contrast, is where you're leaving out the like, but essentially the principle is rather similar. So you might say it's raining cats and dogs. So again, it's very well-established metaphor. Everybody knows it's not actually raining cats and dogs, but it's raining so hard that it's like sort of things falling out of the sky, or even live things falling out of the sky. Or you might say the wind is howling. It's howling like perhaps a dog or a wolf. Or time flies. Tempus fugit is an ancient Latin metaphor. So time flies, we imagine, we use it when we feel that time is just progressing extraordinarily quickly, sort of supernaturally quickly. Personification is a term that's used when we personify something, i.e. we give it human attributes, person attributes. We imagine it as a thing as a person, with feelings very often, or simply something that enables us to imagine it as a body in space. So, for instance, time is marching on would again be a very ordinary, although quite flowery way of saying that time is moving. Let's get down to do something. Time is marching on. It's time to do this because we've been hanging about rather too long. So you could see that those are all similes, metaphors, personification that we use in everyday life all the time. So our language is full of metaphor and simile and personification. And once we start analysing it, we can see how important it is for our thinking. So much of physics is really unimaginable without metaphor. So a black hole, we know it's not a real black hole, but it's comparing a physical phenomenon, a phenomenon in physics to something that we can easily imagine. So bear that in mind, that these techniques might seem rather technical in poetry, but actually we use them all the time in ordinary speech. So what poetry is doing is taking something very ordinary, that's part of language, but using it in particularly perhaps artistic ways, but above all to communicate something rather special and something rather out of the ordinary. So an orangerie, an orangery, is where Louis XIV had his gardeners grow oranges. for him, so obviously exotic fruits in Europe. And there are two magnificent staircases in Versailles, in this fantastic palace near Paris, each of which is just very wide, very impressive, and seems to almost lead up into the sky, because you can't, from certain angles, you can't really see the top at all. So it seems to just lead upwards. Wie Könige, die schließlich nur noch schreiten, fast ohne Ziel, nur um von Zeit zu Zeit sich den Verneigenden auf beiden Seiten zu zeigen in des Mantels Einsamkeit. So steigt allein zwischen den Balustraden, die sich verneigen schon seit Anbeginn, die Treppe, langsam und von Gottes Gnaden und auf den Himmel zu und nirgends hin. Als ob sie allen Folgenden befahl, zurückzubleiben, so dass sie nicht wagen, von Ferne nachzugehen. Nicht einmal die schwere Schleppe durfte einer tragen. Rilke had visited Versailles in 1905 and then wrote the poem in July 1906. And he'd visited it with Auguste Rodin. And Rodin is an extremely important inspiration for these poems, because what Rilke was really doing with these poems was using words to create something that is as rounded, as complete, as evocative as a sculpture. And you can see, therefore, that things play an important part, because a sculpture is, in a sense, a thing. And here he's using words which are very unthingy to do something rather similar, but it's all happening in our imagination. So if we look at Die Treppe der Orangerie, you can see that straight away it's setting up what's being described through simile. So, wie Könige, like kings, that in the end only stride, almost without goal. So there's a sense then in which we're not even being given the steps at the beginning of the poem. However, the topic has been set up in the title. So the title already establishes what we're envisaging, and it's then through the imagery of the poem that we gradually gain much more of a sense of what this edifice is like and how grand it is. And so straight away, Rilke compares the edifice, compares the steps, the flight of steps, with the kings for whom it was built. And he uses the striding of the kings as a way of evoking the flight of the steps. And at the same time, he evokes then the people who are standing alongside, who are standing forming the boundaries of the path that the kings are taking, and bowing down. And these are the balustrades. So balustrades, there's sort of the railings, as it were, the stone barriers, you might say, to the steps. And they are imagined as the people who stand bowing down before the king going up. But he makes it slightly indefinite insofar as he doesn't say wie ein König, but wie Könige. So there's a certain generalization right from the beginning. So we don't just imagine one king, but we imagine a kind of sort of kings through time. There's a degree of abstraction there that actually, if anything, makes the image even grander, even more sort of imaginable as almost infinite. And what he's evoking there is that movement towards the infinite, which actually you can see in pictures of these steps. You can't, from certain angles, when you're at the bottom, you can't see what's at the top. You can't see the orangery, you can't see the terraces, and so on. And if you look at the poem, you'll find that the actual subject of it, Die Treppe, is not mentioned until the 7th line. And so the whole sentence builds up to that. Wie Könige, fast ohne Ziel, etc., etc., etc. So steigt allein zwischen den Balustraden, die sich verneigen schon seit Anbeginn, die Treppe. So it's building up the sense of the upward movement through our having to wait for the subject of the sentence, through all the different stages of the simile. So the simile is working together with the syntax in order to evoke the movement that is being evoked, even though it's actually a static object, but we're envisaging as a movement because we're waiting for that subject to emerge. And that's something very typical of German syntax, where sort of particularly in formal style, you're used to waiting for the subject. Sometimes a long part of the sentence comes before you get onto the subject. So this is something that poets can then work with, particularly if they're using relatively formal style. And Rilke is here using formal style. And for instance, in Von Gottes Gnaden is a historical concept by the grace of God. And this really meant something in relation to kings. It would mean something in relation to Louis XIV. The idea was, and still is, any of you who watched, for instance, the coronation of King Charles, there was a lot of pageantry around that, which was to do with the idea that the anointing of the king is in some way bestowing something superhuman on that person. So they're not just an ordinary person. They have got this particular role, von Gottes Gnaden, by the grace of God. And this then leads into the imagery about heaven or sky. Now in English, we have sky, which is the physical thing, and we have heaven as the spiritual place where we imagine that souls might go. But in German, both are Himmel. So you can see how actually the language matters, because if you've got Himmel in the German poem, it can seamlessly move from the physical sky that you can see at the top of these steps through to the idea of heaven, which has been introduced already by the concept of God's grace. And that second stanza ends, und auf den Himmel zu und nirgends hin. It is going nowhere. So on the one hand, you've got the idea of the sky or heaven. On the other hand, it's nowhere, it's nothing. So it's sort of balancing between the secular and the sacred. And Rilke keeps the two in balance. This is not a religious poem as such. And then you can see, having had already the wie, typical of the simile, here you've got als ob, as if. And whenever we say it's as if something is like something else, then we are using simile, effectively, because we're making a comparison. We're making a comparison that's often quite adventurous, quite surreal, but we're signalling that we're aware that it's surreal, and we're comparing the real to the imagined. And so here he's doing this twice, so wie Könige and then als ob sie allen Folgenden befahl, zurückzubleiben. And here it's as though the steps are speaking. It's die Treppe, so steps in plural in English, but in the singular in German. Als ob sie allen Folgenden befahl, zurückzubleiben. And you can here see enjambment, if you may have come across that. An enjambment is if the sentence runs on beyond the end of the line. It's a run-on line. So als ob sie allen Folgenden befahl, zurückzubleiben. Jemandem etwas befehlen would be the structure, to command somebody to do something. Jemandem etwas befehlen. And that means that the sentence isn't complete, the syntactic unit isn't complete until we've got the zurückzubleiben in there as well. And so you get that sense of a slight hesitation at the end of the line, which breaks the syntactic unit. It makes us sort of wait a bit, and it seems to almost replicate that sense of commanding that they should stay back. Sodass sie nicht wagen, von ferne nachzugehen, so that they should not dare to follow, even from afar. Nicht einmal die schwere Schleppe durfte einer tragen. Nobody was even allowed to carry the heavy train. And so it finishes on that negative, but at the same time, it evokes the heaviness of the train even more, because it's the steps themselves, imagined like a king or like kings carrying their heavy train. And if you look at the picture of the steps, you can see that this is an enormous edifice, an enormously heavy train. And so it's evoking through that image of carrying a heavy regal train that the magnificence of the steps becomes all the more magnificent. So if you look at Rilke's Neue Gedichte, you'll find that in each one he uses imagery in very complex ways. And so if we take sort of perhaps the most common forms of imagery, simile, X is like Y, metaphor, X is Y, and personification is imagining a thing, something inanimate, without a soul, without thought, as something sentient, something that feels, something that is like a person, hence personification. You are turning it into a person. Now, if you look at Die Treppe der Orangerie, you can see that Rilke starts off with a title that is entirely factual. It's a thing. So it sets up, this is a poem about some steps. Not very exciting. But with the very first words, he's comparing these steps with kings. And that comparison, that simile, is sustained right the way through, but then made more complex by building in other similes, by building in metaphor, by building in personification. But you can see how it's personifying straight away these steps as kings, as people, but doing so only as a comparison. So it's not challenging us to do anything that contradicts our logical knowledge or our factual knowledge that a set of steps is not like people. But then he introduces the two sides of the steps. So these are the balustrades that are mentioned at the beginning of the second stanza, in the fifth line. So steigt allein zwischen den Balustraden. That's the actual name, as it were, of the part of the architectural edifice. He's already introduced those parts at the side of the steps as die Verneigenden, the people who are bowing down. So he introduces the imagined, personified version of these stone balustrades before naming them. So he's activating the imagination in order to make us more engaged. We're having to think about, well, what are these Verneigenden? It seems fanciful, but then it's explained when he mentions die Balustraden, which is quite an elevated word, but very also quite technical for such a stone structure. And you've also got Die Treppe steigt, which is it a metaphor? Isn't it? It's quite a common way of saying the steps lead up. But at the same time here, it's invested with the sense of the king's climbing up this edifice. So you can see how he's playing with something that's actually quite strongly embedded in how we think of steps as rising up, as climbing up, as it were, but connecting them with human beings. And then at the beginning of the final stanza, you've kind of got this als ob, as if the steps were commanding all the followers to stay back. So it's as if, but at the same time, it's elaborating the image. So we're now thinking of the steps as giving command, as being kings themselves. Not just something that kings walk on, but something that is like kings and that begins to have, sort of, as it were, the ability to do things like a person. And then nicht einmal die schwere Schleppe durfte einer tragen. At that point, the metaphor becomes the reality. Because here there's no als ob, there's no wie, there's no die Treppe ist wie eine Schleppe. The steps have become the train, and nobody was allowed to carry it. And here you can see it's in the past, so it seems to be situating it in history. It's situating it in a grand history, the grand history of Louis XIV, and at the same time imagining the steps as something that is a body that can climb, has feet by implication, and that is carrying this train. So you can see how simile, metaphor, and personification move right the way through the poem and are used in extraordinarily subtle ways with transitions from one to another. And that means that we're not logically analysing exactly what the difference is between fiction and reality. We're gradually merging the two, and we're sort of shifting, moving backwards and forwards between them. And it means that the illusion isn't broken in any obvious way, because it's always kind of rooted in, it's sort of connected back to the reality of what has been set up in the title. But at the same time, it's also moving into something extraordinarily fanciful.